Hello, everybody. Welcome. We're now ready to begin today's webinar, which is the role of employee ownership in creating a just economy. My name is Bethany Dennis. I'm with the Rutgers, New Jersey, New York Center for Employee Ownership. I will be your moderator. We are very pleased to have with us Nick Romeo, who's going to be discussing his new book, The Alternative: How to Build a Just Economy, in which he reports on new innovative approaches to building a more equitable economy. Nick will be summarizing some of the major arguments from the book and will briefly explore the role of economics education in creating our current economic reality and consider the power of both living wages and job guarantees before turning to employee ownership. I wanted to remind the participants that 5 of you who are in attendance today will be randomly selected to receive a complimentary copy of Nick's book. Thank you, Nick. The webinar is scheduled for 45 minutes and we're going to have Q&A at the end. So participants, we ask that you please stay muted and then you may submit your questions in the chat and Nick will answer them at the end. So now it's my great pleasure, as always, to turn it over to Jim Therese. He's the Associate Director of the Center for Employee Ownership, and he's going to be introducing Nick. Thanks.
Hey, thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. Just want to spend a few minutes to thank Nick for joining us. Journalist, critic, and essayist Nick Romeo is here to discuss his new book, The Alternative: How to Build a Just Economy, the book was just recently published. If you read The New Yorker, chances are you've read Nick's work. He's contributed a lot of work there, and also to many other major publications, including the Washington Post, the New York Times, Scientific American, The Atlantic, Rolling Stone, and the New Republic. Nick continues to research and write, and he is also teaching in the Graduate School of Journalism at UC Berkeley. Nick, thanks so much for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Bethany. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm actually going to start the presentation today with a video. So this was the source of the last-minute flustered search through Zoom permissions, which hopefully we have now sorted out. So if you just give me 1 minute, this just worked a second ago. So I'm going to start with a little video.
Mr. Lully, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
Excellent.
Glad you could see me at such short notice.
Not at all. Do sit down.
Thanks very much.
Can I offer you a coffee?
Oh, that would be very nice, yes, thanks.
Right. How do you like it?
Decaffeinated, jug method, low mineral content spring water, not quite brought to boil, with semi-skim milk with 1 NutraSweet unstirred.
Right. Mark?
Yes?
Do we still have that chemistry set in the office? Well then, just 1 coffee, please.
Okay.
Right. Now, Mr. Lully, you're after a loan, is that right?
That's about the size of it, yeah.
You say in your letter that you're starting up a new business and you'd like to take advantage of our new Greedo startup package.
That's absolutely correct, yes.
You don't actually say what the product is that you're hoping to market.
As it happens, I've actually brought along a couple of samples with me.
Excellent.
We haven't actually settled on brand names yet, but basically, the blue sachet is cocaine and the red is heroin.
Sorry?
The market research we've done so far has indicated that cocaine is thought of as a brighter, fresher product, therefore the blue, and heroin is warmer, more passionate, hence the red. If you disagree, I'd certainly value your input.
You're planning to sell and distribute drugs?
On the button. Yeah, the market's there, I'm ready to go, and let's face it, Europe's open for business.
Yes.
Problem?
Possibly.
Well, I think perhaps I know what you're going to say. Certainly up until now, this is an area which has been hedged about with a lot of rules and regulations. And to be quite honest, when I first looked at this market, I thought to myself, hey, I'd be better off manufacturing red tape.
Red tape, yes.
But thankfully, those times are changing now. Whole new markets are opening up and I'm ready to play them.
Yes, but
The demand is there, no question.
Is it? Well,
one of the most exciting things for me is that it's such a young market.
young.
Oh, yes, immensely young. Yes, consumer profiling indicates the 12 to 15-year-old segment. And, if we can instill brand loyalty into them at that age, well, that's got to be good news. But yes, you're thinking 12 to 15-year-olds, do they have the income? Well, what I always say to that is this. If the product's right, they'll find the income. Their mother's handbags, car stereos, old age pensioners, wherever it is.
Yes, I hesitate to use a word like this, and it's old-fashioned, but do you think this is strictly moral?
I beg your pardon?
Moral? Do you think it's moral?
Moral.
Yes.
Sure, I haven't actually got any precise figures on that. Susie said she'd do me a bar chart.
No, no. Is it moral to do this at all? With children and so on.
Well, let me just say this. I mean, would you rather we stood idly by and let the Germans, the Dutch, South Americans take over our market share? Huh? Where's your precious morality then?
Well,
Up a gum tree without a paddle, that's where it is. The question is this: either you believe in market forces or you don't.
Well, I can help you there because I don't.
You don't?
No, I don't believe in market forces. I used to, of course, when I was a child, but like everybody else, when I grew older, I discovered it was all made up.
Made up?
Yes, I can still remember the exact day I found out it. It was a Christmas Eve, and I couldn't sleep, and I crept downstairs, and I heard my, parents. They were talking and arguing and laughing about market forces and saying how they were going to have to break it to me one day. Came as a bit of a blow, as you can imagine.
Okay, so I'll pause there. Hopefully that was audible and visible. I'm going to just advance my slide here. So this is a brilliant sketch. Actually, before we go on to the next slide, let's just pause for a minute on Stephen Fry and Hugh Laurie. They did all sorts of amazing sketch comedy, but I think this one in particular is a wonderful way to open a talk about the nature of a just economy, because at a basic level, it captures how strange it is to banish moral concerns from our thinking about markets and economics more broadly. Of course, we laugh when Hugh looks dumbfounded and repeats the word moral, as if he is just completely shocked that someone could think morality had any place in markets. So we might think, okay, this is just the province of British sketch comedy from the early 1990s. After all, they were survivors of Thatcherite England. In fact, it's uncanny how closely this particular sketch anticipates some pretty terrifying developments in the last few decades. I'm thinking of Juul e-cigarettes, which in fact marketed highly addictive products to children. I'm thinking of the Sacklers and what happened with all sorts of pharmaceutical marketing in the last 10 years and the addiction crisis that has caused. So it's actually become quite common to suspend our moral impulses when we think about markets and economics. In this talk, I'm going to walk through some of the ideas in my new book, which is called The Alternative. The title is an allusion to the famous Margaret Thatcher slogan, "There is no alternative," which, is at the heart of this parody, really. So the book really tries to re-inject ethical and moral concerns into our thinking about economics. Beyond that, however, I'm also trying to give specific real-world case studies of some of the people, companies, policies, and institutions that are already successfully doing this. So it's a hopeful book, despite the scale of the problem. Before we get into that tour of real-world institutions, businesses, policies, including, of course, employee ownership, I just want to set the intellectual stage briefly. So where did the idea come from that market forces resemble natural laws akin to the laws of physics or chemistry, and that these laws sanction the suspension of moral concerns? So in fact, there's an old tradition. This is going all the way back to 1822. My first quote on this slide is from David Ricardo, who's one of the founders of what became economics. At the time, it was referred to as political economy. So Ricardo here is opposing poverty relief efforts in England in the early 19th century. And notice how he invokes the principle of gravitation, saying, in effect, market forces, right? Market forces akin to a principle of gravitation make it inevitable that any attempt to relieve poverty will simply strip the wealth and power from one class and make everyone else miserable. Fast forward a century, 1902, the American intellectual William Graham Sumner. Here he's resisting what at the time was the rising antitrust movement, so the effort to resist the concentration of corporate power. Notice again, I'm excerpting an article from him where he's talking about forces and gravitation, and he again uses the term inevitable. Of course, this tradition continues. Final quote on the slide is from Science in 2014, where there are people describing themselves as econophysicists, presenting current income distribution as inevitable. So, the basic theme and pattern here is that something that many of our moral intuitions would resist, whether that's extreme poverty, extreme income inequality, extreme concentration of corporate power, it's actually just the inevitable result of so-called market forces, and natural laws tell us this is the case. So anyone who opposes the current status quo is, by implication, as foolish as a critic of the law of gravitation. Now, there are many economists who have resisted this tradition. And in the first chapter, I talk about some of the people working in the field today who have a much more expansive conception of what economics is, one that includes moral, political, and ethical concerns. So on this slide, I talk a little bit about some of the major thinkers in this tradition. The first is a wonderful quote from John Maynard Keynes, in which he says that economics really has four key elements. There's mathematics, history, what you might call diplomacy or statesmanship, and then philosophy. So the good economist has all of these competencies. Now, my first chapter is all about how economics should be taught today. And in fact, one of the people I interview is an economist from Chile, and at the University of Santiago, he has persuaded his colleagues to triple the humanities requirements for economics majors. So in a sense, he's realizing this Keynesian vision. The second quote on the slide is from the Cambridge economist Joan Robinson. So if you remember in the video, there's a funny moment when Stephen asks Hugh, is this strictly moral? And Hugh says, well, I don't think I have any figures on that. So he instantly appeals to data. But in fact, math cannot solve all of our moral dilemmas. I think the Joan Robinson quote here is getting at that same idea. Finally, Ha-Joon Chang, a wonderful economist who was at Cambridge for many years, he just says quite directly, economics is a political argument. It is not and can never be a science. There are no objective truths in economics that can be established independently of political and frequently moral judgment. So, my first chapter is all about fighting to reform economics education. One of the major players in this fight is a group called CORE. They have released a new and free economics textbook. The free is important because a lot of the competing textbooks retail for about $130 for your intro econ class. So not only is this textbook free, it has a much richer conception of human psychology, in which humans are cooperative as well as competitive. It's much more cognizant of market failures and the limits of markets as mechanisms for distributing resources. It's much stronger on the kind of history of economics and the political and ethical dimensions that the subject inevitably involves. So, you might think, okay, why does economics education actually matter? So, economists themselves are often very aware of the influence they have on shaping our cultural common sense. Famous example is the American economist Paul Samuelson, who wrote, I believe this was in 1990, near the end of his career, I don't care who writes a nation's laws or crafts its advanced treatises if I can write its economics textbooks. So Samuelson got his wish, in fact. His textbook was one of the best-selling books for much of the middle part of the 20th century. Transitioning or maybe just previewing what we'll get to later around employee ownership. This is a comment that Samuelson made on national TV on a CBS interview in the 1970s. He was asked about what were originally called Kelso plans, what today we call ESOPs. And the interviewer asks him, what do you think of these new plans where workers actually get some of the capital? So Samuelson, very dismissive, says, oh yes, and it would be nice to have lollipops grow on trees for the picking. Notice once again, invocation of a natural force, a market force akin to a law of nature. Letting workers own capital is as unnatural as having lollipops grow on trees. And in case you haven't gotten the idea, why not throw in an allusion to the French Revolution? So he says it really has a Marie Antoinette-ish ring to it, let them own capital. So it's really striking to see an economist wield this sort of influence, and it does make you wonder, what if we had had a different economics education going back to the 1970s, in which employee ownership was presented not as a kind of physical and ecological impossibility, but as a very attractive way of organizing business. We're going to come back to employee ownership, but before we do that, I'd like to just briefly give you a tour through some of the other initiatives and ideas that I explore in this book. I think this is helpful to give a more comprehensive picture of the various ways that re-injecting moral concerns into our thinking about the economy could really improve the world for the better. We're going to start in Amsterdam and really throughout Europe with a movement called true pricing. So what economists often call the externalities of goods, these are costs not included in the price mechanism. These can cause enormous human suffering and even environmental collapse, or at a minimum, degradation and deterioration of very fragile ecosystemic goods. The basic intuition here is that the cheap price for many consumer goods is an illusion. And when we ignore these externalities, they don't disappear. It's just that someone else pays them, or maybe something else, maybe an ecosystem. And those someone else's may exist a generation or two from now. But true pricing proposes an alternative way of thinking about prices themselves. And it's responding to this patchwork of different regulations and labels that exists on consumer products. So for instance, you might know that a good is organic. You might know that it's local. You might even look at a fair trade label and say, okay, I have some insight into the labor conditions through fair trade. I know maybe something about the carbon footprint because it's local. And maybe because of the organic label, I know something about the pesticides that were used and how it was grown. But if you wanted a single comprehensive window that provided visibility onto all of the relevant externalities of a good, so we're talking about everything from soil and water deterioration to the level of freedom to unionize that workers enjoyed, the carbon footprint of a good, and literally dozens of other categories. True Price says, look, we can do that. In fact, if we take true pricing seriously, we can know exactly how much for some goods, exactly how much these externalities cost, who's paying them. And by adding that cost back into a price, there are a few options we have. So this is just underscoring the point again, that if we knew the true price of things, we might behave differently. The Rockefeller Foundation, analyzing the American food system, says, look, it's actually about 3 times more expensive than what we actually pay. 3.2 trillion versus 1.1 trillion. So what can we do about it? There are a few ways true prices are already being used. One is as a consumer-facing label. In my view, this is maybe the least promising, but I'll just explain it briefly. There's a grocery store in Amsterdam, and others are following suit, where you actually can pay a higher price for a good. And with some of that extra money generated by a true price premium or surcharge, there are funds that are then generated that can be funneled back to the relevant externalities to try to remediate, offset, prevent, and remedy them in some way, right? That's one application. A second application is an internal auditing tool where companies use true price methodology to track their own supply chains and then to try to lower the scale of their externalities on various ecosystemic and human populations. Now, this differs very dramatically depending on the supply chain. One case study I get into in the book is Tony's Chocolonely. They're a European chocolate company, in fact, founded by a former journalist who was concerned to eliminate human slavery and forced labor in the supply chain for chocolate that was sold in Europe. The final application of true pricing, maybe the most promising, is as a tool for policy. So you can imagine reconfiguring subsidies and taxes in a way that would reward products with lower true prices and tax those with higher true prices so that we would have a more sensible and sustainable food system. But really, true pricing is a versatile tool. It can apply to fast fashion. It can apply to electronics. Once again, you can see how the moral concern that we want to include people who are living far away and who maybe we would never interact with, we still want to include them within our sort of set of moral concerns. This reflects a view of economics that is the opposite of the market forces view that we saw in that opening sketch. Another manifestation of moral thinking with economics is the living wage movement. So in the book, I talk at length about living wages, and one of the people I profile is a young business founder named Aaron Sayedian. Now, Aaron started something called Well-Paid Maids, which began in Washington, D.C. and is now spreading along the Eastern Seaboard. Aaron absolutely understands the basic intuition behind true pricing and the centrality of moral concerns to economics. I love this quote from Aaron where he says, at the end of the day, this is what it costs, right? He's describing his decision to pay living wages. And he says, you're either paying for it now by actually paying the price of the service that allows somebody to live, or you're paying for it in the externality. You're paying for it in the societal and generational costs of how that person's kids are going to grow up. So when business owners do not pay living wages, Aaron is arguing, the costs are just being paid by someone else. They're being paid by society, they're being paid by future generations, they're being paid by their employees' children growing up in an environment of fear, scarcity, and deprivation. Aaron pays incredibly well. He pays well above what even the most widely cited living wage calculator in America, the MIT living wage calculator, generates. Aaron pays above that. And in fact, over the last 100 years, in America, we've sort of gone backwards in our thinking about a living wage. Here I have quotes from Teddy Roosevelt and Samuel Gompers, both around the turn of the 19th to the 20th century. And they're both defining a very capacious vision of what living means. So Roosevelt thinks a living wage should include enough that you can afford education, recreation, childcare, a cushion for sickness, savings for old age. Gompers has a very similar view. And he even frames it in a somewhat loftier way. It's whatever we need to feel self-respect, whatever is required by the rational self-respect of human beings. So I like that definition from Gompers. Now, the MIT living wage calculator has gotten a little bit better in recent years. In 2021, it was expanded to include a civic engagement category. This included the cost of things like recreation, maybe tickets for museums, movies, reading material. But it still makes no provision for eating in a restaurant, for buying gifts for loved ones, repaying a loan, saving for retirement or unexpected expenses, your car breaks down, etc. Or even taking a vacation, however brief. So in the living wage chapter, I argue for a broader and more generous definition of living wages, which is really a return to an older tradition in which living was defined in a more, I think, defensible way, something that when many people hear the term living, in fact, they think of what Roosevelt and Gompers had in mind. For people in the employee ownership community, I think living wages are also very important to consider. If your workers are not going to be able to access their ESOP until they retire or until they move to another job, living wages can really be a difference between a decent and a more desperate standard of living. So continue on our rapid tour of the world and the moral concerns that are relevant to economics. We're going to cross over to Austria, where there's a very interesting job guarantee that's currently being piloted. It's in a small village just outside of Vienna. And here's how it works. Anyone who's been unemployed is eligible to participate, and they get to co-design the type of work that they would like to do with social workers. The purpose of that is twofold. It's meant to both meet the needs in the community, but also to reflect the interests and abilities of the workers themselves. So it's important to distinguish this from a kind of workfare program where someone is forced to take the first job they find, regardless of whether they want or can even physically do the job very well. It's also important to note that no one in the job guarantee is forced to join. They could simply remain on unemployment. Interestingly, though, no one chose that option. And I think this gets at one of the really strong arguments for a job guarantee is that jobs provide more than just income. If people just wanted money, they would have opted to remain on unemployment without having to work. So it counters a more cynical view of human nature in which we're intrinsically lazy and we won't work unless forced to do so. It turns out that work provides all kinds of psychological and social benefits. The site of this trial in Austria is famous from the 1930s when there was a study on the psychological effects of unemployment during the Great Depression. In that original study, a 29-year-old woman was quoted. She was speaking to a sociologist from the University of Vienna, and she says, "If I could get back to the factory, it would be the happiest day of my life." It's not only for the money. So notice again, a job is more than money. Stuck here alone between one's own four walls, one isn't really alive. Now, this second quote is from a man I interviewed when I was on a reporting trip in Austria for the New Yorker a few years ago. And it's uncanny how similar these two comments are. So this was an older man in his late 50s. He'd had a few heart attacks after driving a taxi, and it wasn't safe for him to continue driving. But the bigger problem than the decrease in income was the psychological effects of unemployment. So he says, "I was psychologically destroyed. If you've worked your whole life, even with a lot of stress, and then suddenly you have nothing to do, you think you're not needed anymore. You have your breakfast, and then what am I going to do all day?" So the academics who are currently studying this job guarantee in Austria have done some really interesting quantitative and qualitative analysis of the participants. Their findings support the same results that the early 1930 study in Austria showed, and that also just makes a certain intuitive sense that employment is more than a source of income. It's also a source of esteem, purpose, time structure. And there's all sorts of research showing that the absence of employment is implicated in depression, anxiety, substance addiction, turmoil in personal relationships. So, whether you're concerned about deindustrialization, artificial intelligence, market failures, or even just the kind of monetary policy in which unemployment is a natural consequence of high interest rates used to tame inflation. Whatever you're concerned about that affects unemployment, job guarantees are really a compelling thing to think about. A final thing in their favor is that they put upward pressure on the private sector. So if you knew that you had a very strong public sector option, you might be more inclined to say no to an abusive job in the private sector or a job that didn't pay well. So it would put pressure on the upward pressure on wages in the private sector. It would also put pressure on quality and meaning of work. Basically, the guarantee of a strong public sector option could really help transform quality within the private sector. Okay, we're going to move on to worker ownership, and we're going to stay in Europe before coming back to America. I have a chapter in the book on the Mondragon cooperatives in the Basque Country of northern Spain. So these are fairly famous within the employee ownership world, although a lot of people in America have still never heard of them. So it's worth just kind of keeping in mind that while, living wages and a guaranteed job can be hugely impactful, they can mean the difference between making rent and not, between having the option to leave a bad job and not having that option. These other interventions I've been describing, they're actually fairly unlikely to let workers accumulate the sort of capital that we are referring to when we talk about generational wealth. So I'm thinking of hundreds of thousands of dollars, the kind of money that lets you afford a home, afford college education for many children, etc. Worker ownership, however, really does have that power to help with generational wealth building and accumulation. So in Spain, there's some basic features of the model in Mondragon that actually track really closely to cross-cultural psychological research, where if you ask people to estimate ratios of compensation between a CEO and an unskilled worker, they dramatically underestimate it, and they'll say it may be roughly 30 to 1. So 10 times smaller, at least in America, than it actually is. Then if you ask a second question, what do you think the ratio should be? Most people will say about 7 to 1. So that 30 to 1 figure is still 4 times higher than what people think should exist. So 2 questions in this research that was conducted in countries around the world. What is the ratio and what should the ratio be? Now, Mondragon is defined in part by this 6 to 1 ratio between highest and lowest paid workers. Notice that that's almost exactly the same as the 7 to 1 ratio, which was an average from different countries. There was some variation, which is interesting, but people tended to converge in that ballpark of a 7 to 1 ratio. That seems to reflect a basic cross-cultural intuition about fairness. Notice again the relevance of morality here to markets. So Mondragon, you can think of as a place where what many people think should exist actually does exist to a considerable degree. Not only do they have this pay ratio, they have profit sharing through capital accounts. They have democratic governance in which there's a one worker, one vote policy. There's some reallocation of workers within shared divisions and sectors. So if you're building elevators and your co-op is not doing well, you can move to an elevator, or you can move from your elevator manufacturing co-op to a co-op manufacturing buses, right? And there's some shared skills, but there's also retraining programs, and there's even reallocation of profits. Now, Mondragon has roughly 80,000 workers. The cooperatives span dozens of different industries and sectors. They compete very effectively in global markets. So they're a sort of compelling example of how success is compatible with a more humane vision of economics. One quote that I love from my reporting in Mondragon came from an engineer who declined a higher paying job in Madrid. And he said, "I prefer to live here in Mondragon with a lot of friends than to live alone like a king." I like that quote because it really gets at some of the cultural benefits, including friendships, that having a more compressed spectrum of income distribution can provide. Highly unequal societies have all sorts of non-financial impacts on people, social, psychological, cultural. You know, you can do this with your favorite CEO in America. If you take total, I should have noted this is total compensation, not salary for Diamond, but the point still stands that you plug a Mondragon model into an American company, many American CEOs would not make more than about $250,000 a year, 6 times what their lowest paid employee makes. So, it's a pretty striking model, and it's interesting to think about how American culture would be different if we not only had more ownership at the lower levels, but a cap or a ceiling at the higher levels. That's a really interesting feature of the model in Spain. A final thing about Spain before we move to some employee ownership in America is that, Mondragon is both the result and the cause of an entire culture in the Basque Country. There are cooperative schools where young children learn cooperative values. There are cooperative clubs where people go and cook together. There are cooperative newspapers. So pretty much any aspect of your life, from schools, banking, media, recreation, restaurants, there are cooperative options. So when people in Mondragon kind of look over at America, there's often a level of culture shock where, some of the people I quote in the book, they just have real trouble understanding why executives in America would be fighting to cut the wages of their own employees. It just doesn't compute. So turning from Spain to America, there's a long tradition of thinking in America. And, actually, I'm glad to be giving this talk at Rutgers in part because Joseph Blasi is incredibly insightful on this, as on many other points. But there's a tradition of thinking about worker ownership that dates all the way back to the founding fathers. So I just chose a few of the many possible quotes that one could choose on these themes. And, let's start with Madison here. So he says, the proportion being without property or the hope of acquiring it cannot be expected to sympathize sufficiently with its rights to be safe depositories of power over them. So what is he actually saying here? Well, I think he's saying that there's a basic tension between democracy and an extremely oligarchic distribution of property in which only a few people have most of the property. If you let everyone vote, which of course was not possible when Madison was writing, but he was looking forward and realizing that you couldn't necessarily have both. You would either have to expand ownership of property or you would have to restrict voting rights. Otherwise, the wealthy would risk losing their property through direct democratic votes. Jefferson is also very interested in expanding ownership. Both Madison and Jefferson are talking about land ownership, but it's a pretty small update to replace land with capital. And I think the same observations are very relevant today. People still talk about small business owners as the most precious part of a state, not so much landholders anymore, but the basic insight, they're very perceptive. So if we think about worker ownership in America today, there's all sorts of evidence. I'm just citing a few things. There's a lot of literature on this, but people who work at ESOPs on average have better retirement savings. The ESOP model also seems to provide some protection during economic downturns. During the risk of bankruptcy seems lower. If you remember the Paul Samuelson quote, I think it's just worth recalling how dismissive he was about what were called Kelso plans, but became ESOPs. Today there are close to 14 million participants in ESOPs. They have paid out, just in 2020, about $150 billion to participants. So the benefits of worker ownership are considerable, and it used to be more widespread at some major American companies. This example from Sears I find very striking. If Amazon workers in 2018 had owned as much stock as Sears department store employees did in the 50s, the Amazon workers would have owned close to $400,000 in shares. Now, Since then, Amazon stock has more than doubled and the number of workers has doubled. So if you think about close to $1 million, and I think now over 1 million people driving to deliver packages, people working in warehouses, all of whom had that sort of wealth, that would actually go a long way toward building a middle class in America. In the chapter that actually, employee ownership comes up in multiple chapters in my book, but in one of the ways that it surfaces is actually looking at people taking capital funds in a model that is comparable really to private equity, where they'll acquire a business, they'll convert it into a shared ownership model, and then at some point they will sell it. One of the people doing this, I love this quote that he said to me when we were discussing why he thought this was an important thing to do. He used to work for a big bank on Wall Street, and he said to me, something just didn't feel right. The folks that do 99% of the work, everyday workers, they have no piece of the pie. They just sit on the sidelines and they're sort of collateral damage. So he was describing acquisitions that are not converting their businesses into shared ownership models that are just in it to make more money, like the typical private equity model. So the idea that private equity can help spread employee ownership is somewhat controversial. In the book, I go into some of the more controversial examples like KKR. The person who I just quoted is actually at a smaller outfit called Mosaic. I talk about Apis and Heritage. Those smaller funds are typically doing 100% ESOP conversions. One of the main critiques of KKR is that workers actually get a fairly small piece. They may own only 2% of the company. And so there's a question of whether that even is really worker ownership. And I kind of take up both sides of that debate in the book. One other thing that I want to touch on briefly is the model of turning your entire business over to a legal instrument, a purpose trust. So sometimes this is called an employee ownership trust. Whatever it's called, the mechanism is interesting because the trust becomes the legal owner of the business, and then the trust's overseers have a fiduciary duty to fulfill the purpose, not necessarily to maximize profit. So if your purpose is to only hire workers who were formerly incarcerated, or to donate 25% of profits to an environmental nonprofit, or to never exceed a 10-to-1 pay ratio, highest to lowest, that's then part of the kind of defining legal charter of the business. There's also some application of this tool to real estate markets where assets can be bought up by a purpose trust and then protected from speculative activity by private equity and investors in order to preserve more affordable housing. One of the people I talk about in the book who has done this is a guy named Rick Plimpton, who was retiring after running, or he's one of the two people who was running a big optics manufacturing firm in upstate New York. And he wanted this business to continue to exist. He had watched other businesses like Kodak in Rochester offshore and sort of decimate the blue-collar workforce in that region. He wanted good jobs to exist, including for many of the blue-collar people on the factory floor where they were actually grinding lenses that then end up in all kinds of precision instruments, including ones used by NASA. So he settled on an employee ownership trust, and the profit sharing model, which he has developed and which is very generous, is now protected in perpetuity, such that future hostile takeover attempts would be very, very difficult, if not impossible. So it's a compelling model. Patagonia famously did this in the last few years as well. Another person I spoke to while reporting for this chapter ran a technology consulting firm, and her name's Kate Emery. She's a wonderful business leader, and one of the things she has in her purpose trust is actually a Mondragon style ratio cap, where the highest paid to lowest, I believe it's 10-to-1. That ratio can never be exceeded. So it's a very versatile and interesting tool that is being adopted increasingly across America. To close, I think there are people who have probably much more expertise on this at Rutgers than I do, but it's an interesting and exciting time to think about the policy environment that could help galvanize a broader sort of revolution in employee ownership in America. I'm just going to briefly mention some things that are probably not surprising, but nonetheless very sensible policy ideas, I think. One is procurement. So federal government is an enormous purchaser of goods and services. Having some sort of preference built into procurement contracts in which employee-owned businesses are preferentially rewarded, I think seems very attractive. Of course, there are all kinds of subtleties that one can think about with tax incentives. And I know people at Rutgers are doing a lot of this thinking. So I won't really go into the details here, but you can imagine corporate tax deductions sort of being contingent on certain support for expanding or establishing employee ownership. I mean, one of the things that came out of my reporting is that capital is often a missing piece of the picture. All of these funds that I talked to, they said, there's no shortage of retiring businesses that would make good candidates to transition to an employee ownership model. It can be hard sometimes to find the money to fund those transactions. And, this last piece of legislation currently pending, Employee Equity Investment Act, that would actually perhaps go some distance toward providing more funding in the form of loan guarantees for investment funds that expand employee ownership. This would be through the SBA and using SBIC. So I'm going to pause there because that was a ton of information and I think I'm just about at time, but I look forward to any questions and very much appreciate the chance to share some of these ideas.
Thank you so much, Nick. That was wonderful. Really appreciate your time. I am going to open it up to questions. I know there was some discussion in the chat. If you wanted to, Daniel, if you wanted to mention your comment, you can. And this is a pretty small group. If people want to, they can, share. You can now unmute yourself if you want, and share your screen if you want to speak, or if you feel more comfortable putting your comments in the chat. We'll get to them. And Jim Therese, if you are still around, let me know. Oh, there he is. Hi.
Hi, Dan Fireside. I was in charge of raising capital at Equal Exchange, one of the larger worker co-ops in the US for about 11 years, and I've been doing it as a consultant for a variety of organizations in the last couple of years. Really appreciate this presentation and look forward to seeing the book. I just was making a point because when I first learned about the pay ratio disparities, I realized that the official statistics that came out of Sarbanes-Oxley and that are most likely often quoted talk about highest to median, and when social enterprises and co-ops and places like Mondragon engage in this, they're generally talking about highest to lowest. And when you think about Jamie Dimon versus his lowest paid employee, it's 20 zillion%. So it's even worse.
Yeah.
Was my point. And I think that gets lost a lot because people, 300 to 1. Well, you're the CEO of a big bank, but it's actually even more insane than most people realize. That was just my point.
Thank
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That's an important thing to remember.
you. All right. Any other questions for Nick, please? Jim, you still there?
Yes, I am. I had a question for Nick. Nick, are you doing any additional writing on these subjects now or research?
Yeah, I am broadly. I'm finishing up a story on housing at the moment, which is looking at whether the kind of collective bargaining model of unions can be applied for renters. So can tenants unionize? Um, so there's been a lot of activity in the last few years where tenant unions are trying to bargain collectively with large landlords. This is happening in Kansas City, also in San Francisco. And there's a history of this in America that dates back to New York City around the turn of the century. And, so broadly speaking, I certainly am still um, interested in the themes of this book, and I'm doing more writing on it. But I'm kind of, trying to poke into new corners and new directions as well. So things like collective bargaining for housing affordability. Yeah.
I'm interested in that. Um, we have a question in the chat. Greetings from Cape Town, South Africa. Wow, thank you so much. Did you look at platform co-ops, Nick?
So I did some reading about them and spoke to a few people in that space, but they're not actually something I cover in the book. And I'm sort of generally interested in them and would like to learn more about them, but I don't cover them in the book.
Okay, I think we have time for
Just a question for George out there. You posed that question about platform co-ops. Is there anything particular that you'd like Nick to look at with respect to platform co-ops, or us to look at?
Hi, thanks for asking
Hey,
the
George.
question. Nothing I mean, we're in the process of building one. So of course, any information that's out there that we don't know about, we'd love to get. And we see it as having tremendous potential. Put simply, as has been made the case many times, imagine if Airbnb was owned by all the hosts. It becomes a very interesting economic model to follow, and that's what we're going to attempt to do.
That sounds great. Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, George, feel free to follow up with me over email, and I'm happy to learn more about what you're doing and also share anything that might be useful. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
We may have some stuff too, I think. Right, I believe one of our research fellows was doing some work on platform co-ops.
I don't remember offhand, but I will let everybody know that after this, the recording usually comes through, by the end of the day. I'll send this recording out along with Nick's email. If that's okay with you, Nick. And if you have any other questions, you can always ask. We do have a few more though. Nick, why was this of interest, and have you ever worked in an employee-owned venture before?
Yeah, that's a great question. I have not worked in one. I wish that I had, though, after doing the reporting. And it's of interest just because of all of the severe challenges, that are kind of unmistakable when you talk to people who are working in conventional businesses, or, just when you sort of look around the world and you look at the level of wealth inequality, you look at some of the political and ecological crises we're facing. My interest was in trying to find specific models that are working to some extent, that are hopeful. I mean, there's so many books where, and I don't mean this in a critical way, but they just sort of diagnose how terribly wrong everything is, whether that's with economics or politics. And it's like, I sort of share a lot of the fears of those authors, and yet my goal was to try to find things that work, and that if more people knew about them, could actually improve the world in a tangible way.
Yeah.
Yep.
That's good. Thank you. Hello from New York. Have you ever seen any employeeship models with a unionized workforce?
Yeah, I mean, so they do exist. That's something that I talk a little bit about in one of the chapters in the book where, I mean, it's interesting if you go all the way back to people like Carnegie, Rockefeller, some of the early American industrialists, and Joseph Blassie is very strong on this in his writing. There's a tension between unions and employee ownership. And in fact, the reason that some of the early people like Carnegie and Rockefeller endorse it, you know, does seem somewhat cynical, where they can say, look, you own part of the company. You don't need a union. You're the owner too. So I think there is some tension, but I don't think it's sort of a necessary tension. I don't think it has to be an either or situation. I mean, like in Mondragon, there have been back and forth unionization efforts where, sometimes the unions get very upset and they say, you're basically using the employee ownership as camouflage to suppress us, and we still need a union. But then at the same time, other people genuinely say, well, look, we get to vote on everything already through the one worker, one vote model of governance. There's no sort of additional benefit to having a union. So I don't know. I think it's an interesting question, and they seem to be framed as antagonists, but I don't think they have to be.
Interesting. I think we have time for one more question. Did you look at alternative capital raising strategies like the use of non-voting preferred stock? This is from Daniel Fireside again. He said, I have found it extremely useful for worker-owned enterprises that need capital but don't want to give up worker control.
I would love to hear more about that. No, I don't have any deep expertise on that, but I would love to hear more about that from Daniel.
Okay.
Yeah.
Maybe we can follow up
Yeah.
after this. It's
Yeah.
I've helped co-ops raise tens of millions of dollars, and typically enterprises that need capital but are hesitant to do it because of the fear of losing control.
Gotcha. Yeah.
All right, everybody. Perfect. It's just about 1:30. Nick, if you don't mind sharing your screen one more time, I just have some final slides from on the Rutgers side that I wanted to share. If you can.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thank you.
Let me do that.
Oh, there we go. We got through that. All right. So I just wanted to plug real quick. Most of you have been here with us before, know about this program, but I wanted to remind you about the Employee Ownership Online Education Program. The W.K. Kellogg Foundation gave Rutgers some money a few years ago, and we worked with DOWI, also called the Democracy at Work Institute. We developed this program, and it's a self-paced online program. It was geared toward individuals, minority individuals, like women-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, but it's free and available for anybody. It has 2 tracks. We have the ESOP track, the worker cooperative track, and again, it's free. There's the link. I will send it out again when I send out this. Send out the recording, and also just wanted to let you know that there's more to come. We got more money from Kellogg, and we're going to be, over the next 18 months, we're going to be developing content for the business providers, because that's really where, we've heard that there's a need, like, to educate the service providers, like the lawyers, who do the transactions, the
Accountants.
accountants. I was getting there. The accountants, and in between. So we're going to be working on that content. We're also we're going to be having a conference that'll be local. Believe a live conference next spring for those groups. So if you are in the general East Coast area, we'll give you some. We'll probably announce that in probably the end of the summer, in the early fall. about that. But again, this is free now, and we'll be adding content throughout the year. And the next slide, Nick, is just, I think, our contact information. Bill Castellano is our executive director. This is Jim Therese, and I'm Bethany Dennis. We have a website, ownership.rutgers.edu. All of our past webinars are on our resources page, and we'll be putting this recording on that resource page as well. And I'll be sending that out. And most importantly, we'll be doing a book drawing. So I will be emailing you if you are one of our lucky winners in the next day, maybe possibly on Monday. So that's it. Thank you so much for your time. Nick, it was really great to have like a much broader view than the perspective than what sometimes we have in our other webinars, which kind of sometimes get down to the nitty-gritty. So this was really refreshing, and we're looking forward to seeing what you do next. So we really appreciate your time spending this past hour with us.
Thanks very much, Nick.
Thanks to you both. Yeah, and thanks to everyone for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Nice
Have a
job,
good weekend.
everyone.